So this is Motor Learning 2. In the previous lecture, we looked at the types of cues and the way you communicate with your client. In this video, we're going to be looking at how the actual process of teaching the movement. So we're going to understand the learning experience from the client perspective, and we're going to look at the best ways to provide instructions and to demonstrate to maximize learning. And then in the third video, we'll look at the feedback and the way to design practice to maximize retention. So again, we're looking at motor behavior, and motor control is more of the underlying processes that are not within our conscious thought. We have motor development, which is the practice over time. And then in this case, we have the motor learning, which is the acquisition of the skill sets. In the learning journey that we're looking at, and we kind of had you go through this in reverse order, we start with, in this class, we started with like perfect exercise technique, right? Textbook perfect. And that's the goal that you're trying to achieve. We assume that since we are all going to be professionals in the field, we're already experts, so we can assume some level of competency. Where you really start is down here in the initial aspects. So let's say we start teaching movements or skills that you don't know, that you're a total beginner on, or you're just not that competent with. You have to start from somewhere. And you start with the show, tell, do, where you have this introduction to the movement and the start of the learning process. And then you have the client do. They start doing it, and you start to see things that are wrong that need improvement. And this is where the cueing and the coaching comes from, which we talked about in the last video. And the goal is to get to that exercise technique, that textbook perfect. So you see, you don't start with perfect exercise technique. And again, you might know what perfect technique is, but that's the skill versus the ability component. They need to get to that point as the tissues adapt, so they get those resources. But the process is here where you're eventually getting a textbook perfect, but you need to be able to teach it and introduce it, and then of course coach and cue it. And don't forget, we're dealing with the resources of the human body, right? We have the movement here. We've got the blueprint. They might know how to do it, but do they have the neuromuscular and musculoskeletal resources to actually perform the task? I know how to do this. I know what needs to happen. This is nothing more than horizontal abduction or adduction and trunk flexion through the hip flexors as well. I just don't have the musculoskeletal or neuromuscular resources to perform it or perform it well. Same thing here. I just don't have the resources to do it. Again, you're dealing with that skill versus the ability. Do they actually need the activity, and are there alternatives? Yes, there's no such thing as good or bad in the exercise field. It's just risk versus benefit. And like a behind the head neck press, if they have the resources to do it, it might be okay. But if they don't have the resources, does it really matter if I do it, or can I do some alternative? You have to kind of accept what's more modifiable in that moment. Is it the person, the task, or the environment? Can the exercise be modified to accommodate current ability? If so, then do it. Remember, we're not a sport, and sport does not drive fitness. These powerlifting and weightlifting rules that come into play, these are just rules for a competitive aspect. Now, if you're an athlete and you're competing in that sport, then you abide by that. But if you're a general fitness and you're looking for increased improvement in health and function and longevity and well-being, who cares if you're not squatting deep? Is a partial squat more beneficial than a bad full squat? Or is pulling the weight from the floor as a deadlift, if your form isn't good and your back blows out, was that better for you than maybe doing partial rack pulls where you're not pulling as deep? Do you modify the environment at the time? And again, you're just accommodating this moment. It doesn't mean you do partial squats or partial deadlifts for the rest of your fitness career, but you want to progress and start where you're most appropriate. You have to consider the balance, the coordination, the range of motion, the strength. All of these abilities, these resources change with time. That's the whole point of exercise. You get bigger, you get faster, you get stronger, and you're able to do more. So this is what we'll be doing in class in one of our labs, is that we'll come up with modifications for exercise. We'll take the big six, like the push, the pull, horizontal and vertical. We'll take the hip hinge and the squat, and we will modify the environment. We'll change the task, so like partial movements or some supported movements, or we'll change in the person, and this is where we'll like modify them in space or have them minimize the range of motion. But again, you want to be ready for your adaptations. You never want to necessarily just throw out the exercise. Maybe the exercise is perfect, it's easy, the equipment's available, or that's the only thing available, but maybe a modifiable environment might be. A lot of you guys know that I'm not a big fan of the bench press, but I'm okay with a partial bench press because if you only go down like 90 degrees, the scapula is still free to move. So the process of teaching a task is teaching both movement and exercise. Here are the three things that are coming into play when you look at learning, is that there's got to be motivation. You need to explain the why and not just the what. Like, what is the benefit to the client? They're going to be going through a significant amount of change and maybe a little pain and some sweat and discomfort. They need to have buy-in. You need to forge the connections between the client and the target skill. Why? What is it in it for them? You also want to dig a little bit and take advantage of past experience, right? When you're trying to teach something, you're going to have these movement elements, so the actual movement itself, the perceptual, what they can perceive, so what they can sense, what they can feel, what they can see, and the conceptual elements, what they can think. And so all of things are going to come together, and I'm going to pop up a list here and just kind of look at it for a second. But people already sit down, so they already know kind of how to squat. They know how to give a hug, so they know how to do scapular protraction and retraction. You know, people have lifted heavy stuff off the ground, so they've already deadlift. People have pulled open a door, so they've already pulled or done a row. So now it's up to you to get creative and figure out how you connect any of these, the movement, the perception, the concept, with your client, maybe all three, right? And this kind of makes up the basis of the analogies and the verbal cues that you're going to use. The client's focus is important, and this is where the external versus internal cues come into play. But getting people to think externally versus internally isn't just thinking, it's more of the focus aspect. What your client is focusing on is important to the learning process. Beginners, they're 100% in their own heads. During squat, okay, knees out, track the feet, stick the butt out, go slow, go down. They don't have a lot of resources left over, and their focus is very narrow and very internally. So they're really much over in this end of the spectrum. Now you compare that to experts, they're more in the environment. They're thinking during a squat like, okay, one more, drive out of the hole, push, 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 push. I mean, their focus is very external, very outside of their body, and very broad, and they can back and forth between broad and narrow. But they also have the ability to internally assess, and they can analyze like, okay, that felt right, that didn't feel right. They might not be able to identify, pinpoint what the problem was, but they might be able to say, hey, you know what? Can you check out my squat? Looks a little off. But you can see that experts are really more towards the external focus. And that's why it's important to understand where your clients are at. The experts and beginners have the same amount of mental resources. Just some other things are happening behind the scenes than others. The brain can process 11 trillion bits of data per second, and that's quite a bit. These boxes here kind of visually show that one box is about 10,000 bits per second. Our conscious thought is like 100 bits per second. So that's nothing compared to what the brain's capacity is, right? So if you blew up one of those things, you have about 100 bits per second. And some people have a little bit more, some people have a little bit less. But just for an example, right now for you to pay attention to me, and if let's say you're only paying attention to me, it takes about 70 to 80 bits per second to listen to someone speak. So this whole aspect of multitasking is kind of a myth. Like, so you might have this on in the background, but you can really only give true attentional focus to one thing at a time. So when you're providing instructions, 1 to 2 key points, even if there's 20 things that needs to change, you're just going to pick 1 or 2 of the most pressing aspects. Big picture first and details to follow. Like minimal instructions. It should be words and maybe sentences, but if you're talking in paragraphs, no way. A picture is worth 1,000 words. So if you can provide some kind of visual aspect, and not necessarily provide them a picture, but help paint the imagery through the words that you're using. Show them as much as you can. Keep it simple. Trying to complex things by adding different examples and analogies and going off on tangent, as simple and as straightforward as you can be. So there's basically 5 steps in this showing process. And when you're teaching a new class, and it's the show, tell, do. So when you're teaching a new task, hopefully you can do the exercise, but if you can't somehow, show at least 2, maybe more, of the properly execution of the exercise. If you can't perform the exercise perfectly, bring in a video of it done right. Being able to visualize vividly what an exercise should look like is essential to the learning process. have them do it, and have them do it for a couple reps. Give them a first one or two to try to work out the kinks. This is the information gathering stage. This is your opportunity to kind of see maybe a couple reps when you're looking from the lateral side, maybe move around a little bit, but try to gather as much information as you can. And then, like I said, keep it simple, stupid. Pick one or two most pressing cues that the client needs. Everybody is different. And in the example of the squat, one client might need to keep their chest up. Another client might be better served by telling them to brace. Whatever it is, like, pick one or two things and go with it. And don't necessarily have to pick two things. If it's just one thing and you think it can have a trickle-down effect, by all means, go for it. This is really where the art of cueing comes in. This is where you're going to start picking verbal cues externally and then bring it internal or using tactile aspect. But you are going to start using your intervention. After you give them the cueing, have them perform the exercise again and go through the process of go through the exercise or go through the observation and move around and see. Pick through the exercise, pick one or two things, and it's a constant process of show, tell, do, show, tell, do, show, tell, do. It just goes on and on and on. So what we'll do in class is pick an exercise, show, tell, do. You'll demonstrate it, you'll instruct it, you'll have me do it. You can kind of see how things are starting to come together is that the first few times we met together, we're going through like basic safety and understanding resistance. Then we're going through like those big 6 movements, those technical competencies. And now you're going to start building up your inventory of cues to start to learn how to communicate. And then you're going to start going through the demonstration process. And then you're going to start putting it together. So you can see how we're kind of snowballing this into that aspect. So the last part of the motor learning aspect is looking at the receiving end, which is the learning process and the learning environment that you create with your client.